Okay, today I want to deal with some various types of research methods. And over the next course of the readings here and in class and so forth, we'll be going over some different methods here. Today our focus will be 4 of them, tomorrow will be just 1. But before we get to those research methods, we have to look at what are the 4 main goals of psychological research. Because depending on what you're conducting, what kind of research you're doing, you're going to have a different goal. So not all of these research methods have all these goals. It will depend on, again, what you're trying to look at here. The first one is describe. Now I'm going to use the topic of depression. And so let's say for depression, let's say you're going to conduct some research here and you simply want to then describe the symptoms of depression. Now at this point we know the symptoms of depression, but every so often we do get a new disorder, or we do get some new phenomenon that we don't know anything about. Well, before you can deal with it, you have to basically almost describe it and say, here's what it actually is, here are the symptoms, here's everything about it that we know so far. Eventually, you might look at maybe predict or prediction. And let's say, again, it's for depression, you might say, well, I want to predict who's at risk for getting depression. And so you could look at different characteristics. You could look at, we could say, genetics and DNA, and characteristics and life history, nature, nurture, all that kind of stuff, and try to predict who might actually develop depression. A third goal might be control. Now with control, that's not coming today. Control is going to be experiments. And with experiments, you have a lot of terminology, lots going on with experiments. But when you conduct an experiment, you are controlling what we call variables. And actually be called what we call an independent variable. You're controlling that, you're manipulating that. And why would you do it for depression? You're trying to maybe control and look at, say, I want to look at treatment methods. And I want to say, okay, here's this new medication. Is this medication better than, say, the old medication? Is this talk therapy better than medication? Whatever it may be. But you're controlling variables to test an experiment. And the fourth goal then is explain. And to me, explain kind of happens at the end. After you've described the phenomenon, say depression, you try to predict who's going to get it, and you're looking at control, you're testing, and now you basically explain, well, why does this even occur? What are the triggers? Why does depression happen in our society, or whatever it may be in society, but why does it happen? So you want to explain it to the population at large. Now this next slide, do not write all these down here. I just want to show them here in terms of where we're going over the course of the next couple days here. Today, we're dealing with the first 4. Naturalistic observation, case study, survey, correlational studies. And there'll be individual slides for the 4. Tomorrow, in terms of the reading, we'll deal with experiments, because with experiments there's a lot of terminology that you have to cover, so it's good to do it by its own. So again, these are the 4 research methods that you would do in psychology, but we're going to look at 4 of them today here. So let's look at naturalistic observation. Now just break the term down. You're going to observe something in its natural environment. So naturalistic observation, you want to observe in its natural environment. So that's the what. Okay? And you could observe animals, you can observe people, doesn't matter. But you're simply going to observe. And the key thing here of the what then is you cannot interfere in what is happening. Because all you're doing is watching animals in their natural environment. If it's humans, maybe children at a playground, people at work, it doesn't matter. But you cannot ask them questions. Okay, so you have to be hopefully not seen. And so you're just kind of watching things unfold as it would naturally in the environment. And that's the big positive there, is that what you see in its natural environment is very hard to duplicate. I mean, if you're going to take animals from their natural setting and stick them in a lab, no matter how good you make the lab look, it's still a lab. It's not their natural environment. If you take people and say, okay, I want you to come to this, lab, and even if you make it look very natural, it's still a lab. It's not them just behaving as they normally would. Because if you're doing naturalistic observation, you have to make sure you're not seen. You want to make sure that your presence is not affecting how they're going to behave. And that's one of the negatives. That's hard to do. That is hard to say. Let's say it's for animals. A lot of studies with animals take a long time, if not decades, because those animals have to become comfortable with your presence, that basically, oh, this person's there, they're not doing anything, they're not going to bother us, we can just go about our business. But that doesn't happen overnight. And imagine like humans, most of us, when we know we're being watched, we behave differently. I mean, it's a natural thing to do. I mean, if my boss, the principal, came in, maybe I'd act differently, maybe you'd act differently. If your parents were sitting here watching you, you might act differently because, again, you know someone's watching you. So the good thing is, again, you can watch it in its natural environment, but you can only now infer, which is another negative. You can only say, well, I think this is happening because of, this. But you really don't know because you cannot ask the people any questions. Okay, so you cannot ask any questions. So that's naturalistic observation. The second research method for today are case studies. Okay, the what is, I call it an in-depth investigation. An in-depth investigation. And so you could look at a person, you could look at a group, you could look at a situation, it doesn't matter. But when I say an in-depth investigation, you basically can do whatever you want. You want to test them, test them. You want to survey them, survey them. You want to interview, interview. You want to watch them, watch them. It don't matter what you do. And so it's a very in-depth investigation at basically what is going on here. The positives here is you typically will do it for something very new, maybe complex or rare. So new, complex, or rare, where now you're saying, well, this is something we've never seen before. We really want to study this. And a case that we're going to look at in Chapter 12 is the case of Jeannie. And if you take sociology this year or take sociology in the future, you'll probably study this case. And what Jeannie looks at is a girl in the early 1970s who was found chained to a potty chair, basically isolated from the world. And even though she was 13 years old, she had very animalistic tendencies. Well, psychologists are like, we have to study this. This is something, we can't duplicate this. We can't just make this happen. We can't stick some child in a closet just for a study. But now this comes around and you say, I need to study this. I need to figure this out. So for rare things, complex, you can study them, you can test them, you can do anything you want to them. Okay. Now the negative, though, is you have to realize a case study, even if it's done with a person, a group, or whatever, it might not be representative of the population at large. You just don't know. You can't take the data from this case study and automatically apply it to everybody. The case of Jeannie, this poor girl, well, she's her own individual self. So the next child who comes along, who's isolated from society, isolated from the environment, and is not, developing in a normal way, well, that case is its own self, and you can only apply things sometimes to that one case. So a case study, think of an in-depth investigation where, again, do whatever you want to do, testing-wise, survey, so forth. And that brings up a survey. Most of you have heard a survey. You've taken surveys in class, maybe on paper, online, or whatever it may be. And, the what, it's going to give you a very broad portrait. It gives you a broad portrait of people's beliefs, people's attitudes, people's opinions. So you have a broad portrait of people's beliefs, attitudes, opinions, etc. Again, you've taken them. There's a census every 10 years in our country. That happens. So it's a very easy way. So here's the positive here. It's an easy way to collect data. And nowadays with technology, all you have to do is create this program and say, okay, sit at your computer and take the survey, and the computer tallies it for you. You don't even got to do anything. You've got to create the thing, and it pumps out all this data. And very, very fast you get all this data. So it's great. However, though, there are negatives. Not all surveys are created equal, if you will. You could have a bad survey. You could have a question. I've given out surveys before for the stat class, and I handed out to, and we had MRTs. We used to have just kind of homerooms and study halls, whatever you want to call them. And kids were like, Mr.K, this question doesn't make any sense. I don't get it. Well, I can't help you. I didn't make the quiz. I didn't make the survey up. And so, really, that survey is just garbage. You just have to throw it out because people are not answering because they don't understand the question. And here's a historical example here of a survey where, again, we think it's so easy to do a survey. Well, historical example here, 1936. Okay, so 1936, right in the heart of the Great Depression. FDR was president, Franklin Roosevelt was president, and he was going up against a guy named Alfred Landon. Now, the newspapers, they did a survey, and they said Alfred Landon is going to win by a landslide. I mean, it's the Great Depression. People aren't happy. He's going to win. They had the newspapers already printed. Alfred Landon wins. You can Google that. You'll find pictures of the paper Landon wins the presidency. Well, FDR wins. Most of you don't know who Alfred Landon is, again, because he lost. Well, how'd they do the survey? They did a phone survey. So even the method of the survey was wrong, because who supported Alfred Landon? Rich people. Well, we're in a Great Depression. Only the minority, a small minority of the population, were wealthy and had money. The rest of the nation is poor. They're not supporting Alfred Landon. They're supporting FDR, so he wins. And the last thing about surveys is think about these topics here. You know, if you were given a survey about cheating, about drug use, sexual behaviors, would you be completely honest? And what we find in psychology is most people are not honest. Even though it's a paper, even it might be anonymous, but when you're talking about cheating, sex, drugs, alcohol, people usually lie. So you have to be very careful with surveys. And then the last one for today is what we call a correlational study. Okay, correlational study. And you may have heard of a correlation. Well, the correlational study, the what, is you're trying to examine a relationship. You're looking at how are variables related. You know, you're looking at trends over time, if you will. Okay, now the positive here is a correlational study does help you analyze data. It's great. You know, you have all this data and you're looking for trends and you're trying to look for a relationship. You know, how does this affect this, if you will? It's great. But what it's not is it's not correlation. And I still remember, you know, in who knows what year of school I learned this in here, but the idea of that correlation is not causation. It's not. It's just one variable, you know, is related to another, but one doesn't cause the other one. For example, you know, especially in today's day and age, that this a myth of, and I say myth, that you could say either viewing violence on television or playing violent video games will cause an individual to be aggressive. Well, that's a false statement. You cannot say that. Now, what you can say is that the more violence a person views, the more violence video games you play, the more likely you are to be aggressive or to show aggressive tendencies, but it's not one's causing the other. Because you could look at it this way and say, okay, if you have a child, maybe this child is very aggressive. I mean, we'll talk about a term called temperament, how they react. So their temperament, their personality, everything about them is just an aggressive, you know, very, you know, lot of energy, just go, 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 go. Well, what kind of sports or things are going to like? They're going to like things like maybe hockey or even now soccer or football, wrestling or whatever. They may like violent sports and violent movies, but that's just because that's what they like. And you take the other child who's very passive, and you have this very passive, very quiet child. Well, what are they going to like? They're going to like probably non-violent movies or video games, etc. So you have to be very careful that one's not causing the other, because you could say that an aggressive individual is going to like aggressive television, and just because I watch, you know, aggression, it doesn't cause me, but there is a correlation. That, you know, they are related, but it's not a causation. And with correlations, you have to talk about what we call positive and negative correlations. Positive, negative. Now, the thing here though is, don't think of it as good and bad. That's not how it works. In a positive correlation, the variables are going in the same direction. I'll repeat that again. In a positive correlation, the two variables, whatever you're studying, are going in the same direction, meaning they're either going up together or they're going down together. In a negative correlation, the variables are going in the opposite direction. So in a negative correlation, one variable will go up, one variable will go down. And here's just kind of a simple graph here. And on the left there, that is a positive correlation. And think about it. You know, the more hours you spend revising your test, okay, the higher your chances are succeeding in the future. So, you know, more television, or more revision, if you will, get higher exam results. And you could say this there for a negative correlation here, that when more, this is, you know, kind of a British thing, jabs, but when more flu shots are given, well, there are less people with the flu. So more flu shots less people with the flu. Here's a couple others here. Positive correlations. Let's say the more education you get in life, the more money you're more likely to make. Not causation, because you could get a lot of education and still not making money, but more education you get, the more money you're going to make. I could flip-flop it, though, and it's still a positive correlation. The less education you get in life, the less money you're likely to make. For the negative correlation, you could say, because it's going opposite direction now, not necessarily bad, I could say, well, the more exercise I get in a day, the less my chances for heart attacks, diabetes, high blood pressure. Another one, you could also say the less education you get down, the more likely you are to spend some time in prison. So less education, your prison chances of spending a night in prison will then increase. Now with correlation, some terms you'll read about as we go through the chapter in the year here, there's something called basically no correlation. Sometimes you look at variables and the variables aren't correlated. They're not related at all. There's no, if you look at these two graphs here, the plotted points would be all over the place. There is no trend. And lastly, you might have what we call an illusory correlation, like an illusory correlation, meaning it seems like a correlation exists, but it really doesn't. So most people think that this correlation might exist, but when you actually look at the data, there's actually no correlation. So we'll deal with those within the reading and throughout the course of the year. But those are the first 4 research methods: naturalistic, case study, survey, and then correlational study. And then next we'll deal with experiments, which is its own little entity.